Louis XIV of France wasn't just another king. He was the Sun King, the absolute monarch who ruled for 72 years, longer than any sovereign in European history. The man who built Versailles, who made France the superpower of its age, who defined what it meant to be royal for centuries to come. History books paint him as the embodiment of divine monarchy, a golden god who danced, hunted, and ruled with superhuman vigor until his dying day. But those history books are lying to you. They're perpetuating a myth carefully constructed by court propagandists and maintained by French historians for over 4 centuries. The reality of Louis XIV's physical existence was so grotesque, so utterly revolting, that even today, many French museums refuse to display the medical evidence. The Louvre won't acknowledge it. The Palace of Versailles tour guides are instructed to avoid the topic entirely. What I'm about to share with you comes from documents that were deliberately hidden, burned, or classified for centuries. Private letters from terrified ambassadors describing scenes that would make a horror movie look tame. Medical records that French authorities tried to destroy but were secretly copied by palace servants. Autopsy reports that were buried in Vatican archives and only discovered through a clerical error in 1891. This isn't just another historical biography. This is the systematic unmasking of one of history's greatest lies. Because Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most magnificent monarch of the Baroque age, spent the last 30 years of his life as a walking, talking, ruling corpse. His body literally rotted while he was still alive, decomposing from the inside out while he continued to demand worship from his subjects. The transformation was so complete, so utterly horrifying, that by the end, his own family couldn't stand to be in the same room with him. Foreign diplomats would vomit during state meetings. Servants would flee their posts rather than endure another day of the stench. Yet somehow, impossibly, the fiction of the divine Sun King persisted. The world continued to bow before a man whose body was dissolving into putrid flesh while his mind remained trapped inside, fully conscious of his own decomposition. To understand the magnitude of Louis XIV's physical collapse, you first need to comprehend what he was before the decay began. This wasn't just some privileged aristocrat who happened to inherit a throne. Young Louis was a genuine physical phenomenon, a man whose natural abilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Standing at 5 feet 8 inches in an era when the average Frenchman barely reached 5 feet 4 inches, Louis towered over his subjects both literally and figuratively. His build was that of an athlete, not through training but through genetic lottery. Broad shoulders that required specially tailored coats, arms muscled from years of sword practice, legs that could grip a horse so firmly he could ride without using his hands. Contemporary accounts describe him as having the perfect V-shaped torso that Renaissance artists used as their ideal. But it was his face that truly captivated Europe. High cheekbones that caught the light perfectly, a strong jawline that projected authority, those famous bourbon blue eyes that witnesses claimed could shift from warm invitation to cold command in an instant. His hair, before the fashion for wigs took hold, was naturally thick and black with a slight wave that framed his face like a dark halo. Women across Europe kept miniature portraits of him hidden in their chambers. Men studied his posture, his walk, trying desperately to imitate that indefinable quality that made Louis magnetic. The young king's daily routine would exhaust modern athletes. He would rise at 8 a.m. and immediately engage in an hour of vigorous dancing practice. Not the gentle court dances you might imagine, but athletic ballet that required jumping, spinning, and maintaining perfect form while wearing 30 pounds of elaborate costume. After dancing came riding, and Louis didn't just ride, he performed equestrian acrobatics that would make circus performers nervous. Mounting and dismounting at full gallop, standing on the saddle while jumping obstacles, controlling his horse with subtle shifts of weight while his hands remained free for sword work. His appetite was legendary but never affected his physique. Breakfast would be a full roasted chicken, a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, and various fruits. Lunch might include 2 different soups, 3 meat courses, vegetables, cheeses, and desserts. Dinner was the true spectacle, up to 20 different dishes served over 3 hours. Yet despite consuming what nutritionists estimate was 5,000 calories daily, Louis maintained his athletic build through sheer physical activity. The king's mental capabilities matched his physical prowess. By age 15, he was fluent in French, Italian, Spanish, and Latin, with working knowledge of German and Greek. He could recite entire books of Virgil from memory. His mathematical abilities impressed university professors who came to test the royal prodigy. He personally designed military fortifications that his engineers claimed were geometrically perfect. His memory was virtually photographic. He could meet a courtier once and, years later, recall not just their name but details about their family, their lands, their political positions. Louis understood power wasn't just about bloodline or wealth. It was about presence, about making every person who encountered you believe they were in the presence of something greater than mere humanity. He cultivated this divine aura through calculated displays of his abilities. He would dance the lead role in court ballets for 6 hours without showing fatigue while older courtiers collapsed from exhaustion just watching. He would hunt from dawn to dusk, personally killing dozens of animals, then appear at evening court looking refreshed while his hunting companions could barely stand. Women threw themselves at him with an abandon that scandalized even the libertine French court. The Duchess of Orleans wrote that Louis had the most beautiful legs in the world, and that watching him dance made her feel faint with desire. Multiple wives of high-ranking nobles risked execution for adultery just for the chance to spend one night with the Sun King. He managed at least a dozen simultaneous affairs while maintaining the fiction of devotion to his queen, juggling mistresses with a scheduling precision that would impress modern CEOs. His sexual stamina became the stuff of legend. Palace records, written in coded Latin to hide their explicit nature, suggest Louis could perform sexually 4 to 5 times per night with different partners. His official mistress, Madame de Montespan, claimed he was inexhaustible as the sun itself in her private letters. Even his physicians, tasked with monitoring the royal health, expressed amazement at his virility. Dr. Vallet wrote in 1668 that the king possessed the sexual vigor of 10 ordinary men combined. But beneath this glittering surface of divine perfection, something was already going terribly wrong. The warning signs were there from the beginning, ignored or deliberately suppressed because they didn't fit the narrative of the God King. Looking back through medical records that survived the systematic destruction, we can trace the roots of Louis's eventual decomposition to decisions made in his youth. The most catastrophic choice was his relationship with water, or rather, his complete rejection of it. Louis XIV bathed fully exactly twice in his entire adult life. This wasn't unusual for the era, but Louis took it to extremes. He believed, with an almost religious fervor, that water weakened the body's natural defenses. He thought it opened the pores to evil humors and malevolent spirits. Instead of bathing, he would have servants rub him down with scented cloths, changing his linen shirt 3 times a day and believing this constituted proper hygiene. The palace at Versailles, for all its magnificence, was essentially a giant bacterial breeding ground. No proper sewage system existed. Courtiers would relieve themselves in corners, behind curtains, in the gardens. The palace employed a team of servants whose sole job was to clean up human waste from the corridors each morning. The combination of thousands of unwashed bodies, no ventilation system, and accumulated waste created what modern epidemiologists would recognize as a perfect storm for infection. By age 25, Louis was already showing signs of severe digestive issues. He suffered from chronic constipation that required daily enemas to resolve. Not just 1 or 2, but sometimes up to 4 enemas per day, administered by physicians who believed this was purging evil humors from the royal body. The constant invasive procedures damaged his intestinal walls, creating microtears that would never properly heal. These became entry points for bacteria that would slowly colonize his digestive system. His teeth began deteriorating in his 20s, a combination of the massive sugar consumption and complete absence of dental hygiene. Louis would clean his teeth by chewing herbs and rinsing with wine, believing the alcohol purified his mouth. The reality was that he was feeding the bacterial colonies that were slowly eating away his teeth from the inside. By age 30, his breath was so foul that courtiers would discreetly hold scented handkerchiefs to their noses during close conversations. The king's skin told another story of slow degradation. Portraits from his youth show clear, glowing skin. But by his 30s, he suffered from chronic boils, cysts, and carbuncles that would appear all over his body. The worst were in areas where sweat accumulated: his armpits, groin, and buttocks. These weren't just simple pimples but deep, infected abscesses that would fill with pus and blood. Court physicians would lance them with dirty instruments, creating more infection sites that never properly healed. Dr. Vallet's secret medical diary, discovered in 1957 in a false bottom of a desk at Versailles, reveals disturbing details. By 1670, Louis was experiencing regular fevers, chronic headaches, and periods of delirium that were hidden from the court. He would wake screaming from nightmares where he claimed demons were eating him from the inside. Modern analysis suggests he was already suffering from multiple chronic infections that his immune system couldn't fight off. The sexual excesses that had made him legendary were also destroying him from within. Medical historians now believe Louis contracted syphilis in his 20s, though the symptoms were attributed to other causes. The mercury treatments prescribed by his physicians, meant to cure various ailments, were actually slowly poisoning him. Mercury accumulated in his tissues, damaging his kidneys, liver, and nervous system. The trembling hands that appeared in his 40s, dismissed as fatigue, were likely mercury-induced neurological damage. His diet, while impressive in quantity, was catastrophic in quality. Everything was preserved with massive amounts of salt or sugar. Vegetables were boiled until nutritionally worthless. Fruits were candied or turned into sugar-heavy preserves. He consumed virtually no fresh food, creating severe vitamin deficiencies that weakened his immune system and slowed healing. Scurvy-like symptoms appeared periodically: bleeding gums, slow-healing wounds, chronic fatigue. The constant wearing of heavy, restrictive clothing created its own problems. His elaborate coats and breeches, sometimes weighing over 40 pounds with all their decorations, restricted circulation and trapped moisture against his skin. Fungal infections flourished in the warm, damp environment. What courtiers saw as magnificent royal attire was actually a breeding ground for pathogens that were slowly colonizing the king's body. Most critically, Louis developed what physicians called the royal disease, severe hemorrhoids that appeared in his early 30s. These weren't simple hemorrhoids but complex networks of swollen, infected tissue that made sitting agony and defecation torture. The treatments were barbaric: hot iron cauterization, applications of lead-based ointments, fumigation with sulfur smoke. Each treatment caused more damage, creating scar tissue that would eventually become the site of the famous anal fistula. 1686. The year 1686 marked the point of no return in Louis XIV's physical destruction. What began as a minor discomfort in January would cascade into a medical catastrophe that transformed the Sun King from a functioning monarch into a grotesque parody of his former self. This was the year the rot truly began. January 8, 1686, started like any other day at Versailles. Louis rose for his lever ceremony, allowing his highest nobles the privilege of watching him dress. But as he stood from his bed, a sharp pain shot through his lower back and into his buttocks. He winced, something the Sun King never did in public, and several courtiers noticed. The Marquis de Dangeau wrote in his diary that His Majesty seemed to struggle with his balance, grabbing the bedpost for support. By January 15th, what Louis had dismissed as a pulled muscle had evolved into constant, throbbing pain. Sitting became torture. Standing brought relief, but his legs would shake from the effort. Dr. Daquin, the chief physician, examined the king in private and declared it was simply an excess of humors pooling in the lower region. His prescription was more enemas, as if the 4 daily procedures weren't enough. Now Louis was subjected to 6, sometimes 8 enemas per day, each one more painful than the last as the inflamed tissue protested the invasion. The location of the pain was particularly problematic for an absolute monarch. This wasn't a war wound he could display proudly or an illness that garnered sympathy. This was an affliction in the most private, most undignified part of the royal anatomy. Louis couldn't admit to his court that his anus was causing him agony. The very thought was incompatible with divine monarchy. So he suffered in silence, or what passed for silence when every movement brought gasps of pain. By February, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. A hard lump had formed near his rectum, growing daily like some malevolent fruit. It started the size of a pea, within a week it was a walnut, by months and it resembled a small apple. The skin stretched tight and shiny, purple-red with infection. The pain was no longer confined to sitting. It radiated down his legs, up his spine, making every breath an effort. Sleep became impossible. Louis would pace his chambers all night, naked from the waist down, trying desperately to find a position that brought relief. Then came the smell. February 12th was when servants first noticed it, a sweet sick odor like rotting fruit mixed with feces. It clung to the king's clothing, permeated his bedding, lingered in rooms after he left. The famous French perfumers were summoned. They created special pomades, burning censers, aromatic wreaths worn around the neck. Nothing worked. The smell grew stronger daily, an olfactory announcement of the king's decay that preceded him into every room. February 20th brought the first rupture. Louis was attempting to sit through a council meeting when he felt a warm wetness spreading across his breeches. The abscess had burst, releasing a mixture of pus, blood, and fecal matter that soaked through his clothing and onto the silk cushions of his throne. The smell was instantaneous and overwhelming. The Duke of St. Simon, who was present, later wrote that several ministers turned green and had to excuse themselves. Louis sat frozen, unable to move without revealing the extent of the catastrophe. He continued the meeting for another hour, feeling the warm liquid pooling beneath him, maintaining the fiction that nothing was wrong while his courtiers struggled not to gag. The rupture brought temporary relief from the pressure but created a new horror. The abscess hadn't healed. It had formed a fistula, an abnormal connection between his rectum and the skin surface. Now fecal matter had a direct path to the outside, bypassing normal anatomy. Louis was literally leaking excrement continuously. No amount of padding could contain it. No perfume could mask the smell. The Sun King had become incontinent in the most humiliating way possible. Dr. Felix was summoned in March, a surgeon with a reputation for discreet miracles. His examination, conducted with Louis on all fours like an animal while servants held candles for light, revealed the full extent of the damage. The fistula had multiple branches, creating a network of infected channels that honeyed through the tissue. Some opened near the anus, others emerged inches away on his buttocks. When Felix pressed on one opening, pus and feces emerged from 3 others like some grotesque fountain. The treatments attempted over the next 6 months would make medieval torture look merciful. Hot iron rods were inserted into the fistula channels, burning the infected tissue in hopes it would heal properly. The smell of burning flesh mixed with feces filled the royal chambers. Louis would bite through leather straps, his screams echoing through Versailles despite the thick walls. After each cauterization, he would be delirious with pain for hours, mumbling prayers and curses in equal measure. When burning failed, they tried chemical cauterization. Silver nitrate, sulfuric acid, quicklime, all applied directly to the open wounds. The flesh would bubble and dissolve, creating more damage that refused to heal. Lead-based ointments were packed into the fistulas, slowly poisoning Louis while doing nothing for the infection. One treatment involved inserting hollow reeds into the channels and pumping them full of wine mixed with mercury, based on the theory that alcohol would purify the corruption. It only spread the infection deeper. The social implications were devastating. State dinners became ordeals of endurance as the smell of the king's condition competed with the aroma of food. Ladies would discreetly vomit into their napkins. Foreign ambassadors started finding excuses to conduct business through intermediaries. The famous lever and coucher ceremonies were shortened, then eventually reduced to token appearances. The man who had made publicity into an art form was now desperate for privacy. By November 1686, Louis XIV faced a decision no absolute monarch should have to make: submit to experimental surgery that might kill him, or continue the slow decay that was destroying both his body and his authority. The surgery that followed would become one of the most documented medical procedures in history, not for its success, but for its unprecedented brutality. Charles-François Felix wasn't just chosen as the royal surgeon, he was commanded by direct royal decree. Refusing meant death. Success meant wealth beyond imagination. Failure also meant death, but probably after torture. Felix knew he had one chance to save both the king and himself. His solution was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He would practice on living subjects until he perfected the technique. Between March and November 1686, Felix performed his experimental surgery on 75 human beings. These weren't volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were prisoners from the Bastille, homeless vagrants rounded up from Paris streets, and hospital patients too poor to refuse. Felix would deliberately create anal fistulas in healthy subjects, then attempt to repair them. The survival rate was approximately 20%. The practice subjects who survived were given small pensions and sworn to secrecy. Those who died were buried in unmarked graves. Felix developed specialized instruments for the royal surgery, each one crafted by the finest metalworkers in France. The bistouri royal was a curved silver scalpel with a blade so sharp it could slice through tissue like butter. He created retractors designed to hold open the royal rectum while he worked. Special probes made of gold were fashioned to explore the fistula channels without causing additional damage. Each instrument was tested on his practice subjects, modified, and tested again until Felix was satisfied. The preparation for the surgery was as elaborate as any court ceremony. 3 days before, Louis was given only clear broths and wine to empty his bowels. He was bled twice daily to weaken his body's resistance to pain, based on the theory that a weakened body would feel less. Prayers were said in every church in France. The Pope himself offered a special mass for the king's recovery. November 18, 1686, 7 a.m. The royal bedchamber had been transformed into an operating theater. The windows were covered with thick curtains to prevent anyone from witnessing the king's humiliation. 6 of the strongest men at court were selected to hold Louis down. 2 for his arms, 2 for his legs, 2 to hold his torso. They were chosen for their loyalty and their ability to keep secrets. Each was made to swear on holy relics that they would never speak of what they witnessed. Louis was positioned on his bed face down, his buttocks elevated on specially designed cushions that exposed the surgical area. A piece of wood wrapped in leather was placed between his teeth. Felix offered a prayer, then began. The first incision was made at 7:15 a.m. The scalpel entered the primary fistula opening, and Felix began cutting upward, following the infected channel toward the rectum. Louis's body went rigid. The men holding him struggled to keep him still as every muscle contracted in agony. Blood sprayed across Felix's hands, more than he expected. The infection had created abnormal blood vessels that bled profusely when cut. Within minutes, the silk sheets were soaked crimson. Felix continued cutting, feeling his way through tissue that was so infected it had the consistency of cheese. The smell that emerged when he opened the deepest abscess pocket was so foul that one of the men holding Louis's legs vomited on the floor. At 8 a.m., Felix reached the rectum itself. This was the critical moment. He had to cut through the rectal wall to connect the fistula to the normal anatomy, allowing it to heal from the inside out. One wrong move would puncture the intestine, causing fatal peritonitis. His hands, slippery with blood and pus, trembled as he made the final incision. Louis screamed through the wooden gag, a sound witnesses described as inhuman, like an animal being slaughtered. The surgery should have ended there, but Felix discovered something that made his blood run cold. There wasn't just one fistula. There were 4 separate channels, branching like roots through the tissue. He had to make a choice: stop now and require multiple surgeries, or continue and risk killing the king from shock. He chose to continue. For another 2 hours, he carved through infected tissue, following each channel to its source, cutting away dead flesh that came apart in his hands like wet paper. By 10 a.m., Felix was finished with the cutting. Now came the packing. Each wound channel had to be filled with linen soaked in a mixture of egg whites and rose oil, believed to promote healing. As he pushed the packing into the wounds, fresh screams erupted from Louis. The king had bitten completely through the wooden gag and was now biting his own tongue. Blood from his mouth mixed with tears streaming down his face, creating pink rivulets on the pillow. When the surgery finally ended at 10:30 a.m., Louis XIV had endured 3.5 hours of conscious torture. The surgical site looked like a battlefield. Where once had been the royal buttocks was now a gaping wound, 4 inches long and 2 inches deep, packed with bloody linen. The amount of infected tissue removed filled a large silver bowl. Felix estimated he had cut away nearly a pound of the king's flesh. But Louis survived, and more remarkably, he was conducting state business within 3 hours. Still lying face down, still bleeding through his bandages, he received his ministers and issued orders. This wasn't courage, it was necessity. Any sign of weakness could trigger a succession crisis. The Sun King had to prove he was still the Sun King, even with a gaping hole where his rectum used to be. The recovery was its own form of torture. The packing had to be changed twice daily, each change requiring the wounds to be probed, cleaned, and repacked. Louis would scream during these procedures, his cries heard 3 floors away. The healing was slow, complicated by constant infection. Pus continued to drain for weeks. The smell, if anything, got worse as dead tissue sloughed off. December 6th brought the horrible revelation that the surgery had failed. New fistulas had formed adjacent to the surgical site. Felix had to operate again, this time for 2 hours. December 8th, another surgery, another failure. December 10th, the 4th and final operation lasted 6 hours. Felix, desperate and exhausted, carved away so much tissue that he exposed the tailbone. Louis passed out from pain 3 times during this final procedure, each time revived with smelling salts to continue the torture. By 1687, the surgeries were complete, but Louis XIV would never be the same. The multiple operations had left him permanently damaged, both physically and psychologically. The Sun King who had once embodied physical perfection was now a medical monster, held together by bandages and hidden behind increasingly elaborate deceptions. The most immediate and humiliating change was his permanent incontinence. The surgeries had damaged the sphincter muscles beyond repair. Louis could no longer control his bowel movements. Feces would leak constantly, requiring him to wear specially designed leather underwear lined with absorbent cloth that had to be changed every 2 hours. The famous royal levees now included a discreet moment where servants would check and change the king's soiled undergarments behind a screen. The smell became Louis's constant companion. No amount of perfume could completely mask the odor of feces and the persistent infection that never fully healed. The surgical sites would periodically reopen, leaking pus and blood. Courtiers developed a complex system of signals to warn each other about the king's condition. A white handkerchief meant the smell was tolerable. A red one meant masks were necessary. Black meant the king was having a particularly bad day and audiences should be postponed if possible. The physical trauma triggered a complete transformation in Louis's appetite. Whether from depression, medication, or metabolic change, he began eating with a desperation that shocked observers. His daily consumption doubled, then tripled. Breakfast became a feast of multiple roasted fowl, entire loaves of bread, wheels of cheese. Lunch might include a whole lamb, several rabbits, dozens of eggs. Dinner was an orgy of consumption that could last 4 hours. The weight gain was catastrophic. From 165 pounds in 1685, Louis ballooned to 220 pounds by 1690. By 1695, he weighed 250 pounds. By 1700, he had crossed 280 pounds. The athletic king who had danced for hours was now so obese he needed assistance to rise from chairs. His thighs chafed so badly when he walked that the skin would bleed. His belly hung over his belt, requiring specially tailored clothing that tried to hide his bulk. The famous portrait painters were instructed to paint him only from carefully chosen angles, using drapery and shadows to disguise his massive girth. The year 1693 brought a new horror that would complete Louis's transformation into a living grotesque. His teeth, already damaged by decades of sugar consumption and poor hygiene, had become infected abscesses. Dr. Dubois, the royal dentist, convinced Louis that the only solution was complete extraction. Every single tooth would be removed to prevent the infection from spreading to his brain. The dental surgery was performed without any anesthesia beyond wine and opium, which barely dulled the pain. Dubois used primitive pliers to wrench each tooth from Louis's skull. But he was incompetent even by 17th century standards. In removing the upper teeth, he tore away part of Louis's palate, creating a hole between his mouth and nasal cavity. When removing the lower teeth, he fractured the jawbone in 2 places. The results were catastrophic. Louis could no longer chew food, having to gum soft items or have everything cut into tiny pieces. When he drank, liquid would spray from his nose through the hole in his palate. His speech became slurred and difficult to understand, complicated by constant drooling from his toothless mouth. The Sun King now looked like an ancient peasant, his face collapsed inward, his lips pursed over empty gums. The psychological impact of these physical changes was profound. Louis, who had built his entire identity on physical perfection and divine authority, was now trapped in a body that betrayed him hourly. He became paranoid, convinced courtiers were mocking him behind his back. He would fly into rages over minor slights, then weep uncontrollably. The confident monarch who had declared, "Laissez moi," now avoided mirrors and refused to look at his own reflection. Yet somehow, impossibly, court life continued its elaborate charade. The daily ceremonies proceeded as if nothing had changed. Courtiers competed for positions near the king despite the smell. Ambassadors presented credentials while trying not to stare at the drool sliding down the royal chin. The entire palace participated in a massive collective delusion that the Sun King was still the Sun King. The effort to maintain this fiction reached absurd heights. A team of 20 servants worked full-time just managing the king's physical appearance. They would apply thick white makeup to hide his gray, unhealthy complexion. Rouge was painted on his cheeks to simulate health. An elaborate wig covered his balding, scabrous scalp. His clothing was designed with hidden structural supports to help him stand upright despite his enormous weight. The medical treatments continued, each one more desperate than the last. Mercury pills for his persistent infections, causing tremors and confusion. Antimony purges that left him weak and dehydrated. Applications of lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned him. Bloodletting that removed pints of blood weekly, leaving him anemic and exhausted. The cure had become worse than any disease. By 1700, courtiers secretly referred to Louis as the walking corpse. He moved through Versailles like a ghost of his former self, trailing perfume and decay in equal measure. His daily routine, once a celebration of royal vitality, had become a medical management protocol. Wake, change soiled garments, apply medications to suppurating wounds, force down food he couldn't taste, endure the hollow ceremonies of court, collapse exhausted into a bed that reeked of his own decay. Versailles, the architectural wonder that was meant to showcase the glory of absolute monarchy, had transformed into an elaborate theater dedicated to hiding the truth about its decomposing monarch. The entire palace, with its 10,000 inhabitants, became complicit in maintaining the most spectacular medical cover-up in European history. The protocols developed to manage Louis's condition were more complex than many military operations. Every morning, a team of servants would arrive 3 hours before the official lever to prepare the king for public viewing. They would clean the feces and pus that had accumulated overnight, change bandages on wounds that never healed, apply layers of powder and perfume to mask the worst of the smell. The soiled linens would be burned immediately in special furnaces to prevent anyone from seeing the evidence of royal decay. A new position was created, the Master of Royal Fragrances. This unfortunate soul commanded a team of 50 perfumers who worked around the clock to create ever-stronger scents to mask the king's odor. They burned Arabian incense in silver braziers placed strategically throughout the palace. They created pomanders of ambergris and musk that courtiers were required to wear. They sprayed rose water on curtains, furniture, even the air itself using primitive atomizers. The annual perfume budget exceeded what most European kingdoms spent on their entire military. The architectural modifications to Versailles were equally elaborate. Secret passages were constructed so Louis could move between rooms without being seen during his worst episodes. Special ventilation shafts were installed to direct air flow away from the king toward windows. Furniture was redesigned with hidden compartments to store medical supplies and spare undergarments. The famous Hall of Mirrors had its windows modified to open quickly when the royal stench became overwhelming. The human cost of maintaining this fiction was enormous. Servants who worked closely with Louis had a turnover rate approaching 80% annually. Many developed psychological conditions from the constant exposure to decay and death. Several committed suicide rather than continue their service. Those who endured were paid extraordinary sums and sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. A special fund was established to pay off families of servants who fled France entirely rather than risk revealing what they had witnessed. The court developed its own language to discuss the king's condition without actually acknowledging it. His Majesty is indisposed meant the fistulas were leaking badly. The king requires solitude for prayer meant he was having uncontrollable bowel movements. Royal meditation was code for the hours Louis spent having his wounds cleaned and dressed. Everyone understood these euphemisms, but no one dared speak plainly about what was happening. Foreign courts were not fooled. Diplomatic dispatches from this period, discovered in various European archives, paint a horrifying picture. The British ambassador wrote that approaching Louis XIV was like entering a charnel house where bodies have been left to rot. The Spanish representative reported that he had to excuse himself to vomit after a particularly close encounter with the king. The papal nuncio described the French court as participating in a mass delusion that their king is not dying by degrees before their very eyes. Yet France's enemies couldn't fully exploit this weakness because Louis, remarkably, retained his mental faculties and iron will. Even as his body decomposed, his mind remained sharp. He continued to make strategic decisions that expanded French power. He negotiated treaties, planned military campaigns, managed the complex politics of European succession. Foreign powers faced the surreal situation of negotiating with a man who was literally rotting while speaking to them, yet who could still destroy their kingdoms with a single command. The noble families of France found themselves in an impossible position. They had invested everything in the Versailles system, which required them to attend court to maintain their status and wealth. But attending court meant enduring the daily horror of the king's presence. Some families fabricated elaborate illnesses to avoid attendance. Others sent younger, expendable sons to represent them. The most desperate hired actors to impersonate them at court functions. The medical establishment was equally trapped in the deception. Physicians who suggested that the king's condition was beyond their help were dismissed or worse. Those who promised miracle cures were rewarded regardless of results. The royal medical archives from this period show a parade of charlatans and quacks, each offering more bizarre treatments. One suggested daily baths in virgin's milk. Another prescribed consuming powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusks sold at astronomical prices. A German doctor convinced Louis to sleep with magnets attached to his body to draw out the corruption. The situation reached peak absurdity during state occasions. Foreign dignitaries would arrive at Versailles for elaborate ceremonies, only to find themselves participating in a grotesque pantomime. They would process through halls thick with incense smoke, past courtiers wearing enough perfume to make eyes water, to kneel before a monarch who was visibly decomposing. They would present gifts and treaties while trying not to breathe. They would attend banquets where the guest of honor couldn't chew his food and leaked bodily fluids throughout the meal. The marriage of Louis's grandson in 1697 became a particular low point. The ceremony required Louis to stand for 2 hours while the couple exchanged vows. Witnesses reported seeing liquid dripping from beneath his robes, forming puddles on the chapel floor. The smell became so overwhelming that several wedding guests fainted. The bride, a German princess, was observed crying not from joy but from the effort of not vomiting as Louis kissed her cheeks in blessing. Yet the official court records describe it as a magnificent occasion showcasing the glory of the French monarchy. Horrifying that end would be. Louis XIV, now 76 years old and already more corpse than king, was about to experience a final degradation that would surpass everything that had come before. His body, held together by will and medical intervention for so long, had decided to complete its decades-long journey toward total put. Continue. Edit. Faction. The morning started with Louis complaining of a tingling sensation in his left leg. After decades of medical catastrophes, the court physicians barely paid attention. Dr. Fagan, now ancient and nearly blind himself, diagnosed it as simple fatigue from the previous day's council meeting. He prescribed rest and warm compresses. This would prove to be the most catastrophically wrong diagnosis in medical history, as what Louis was experiencing were the first symptoms of senile gangrene. By August 13th, the tingling had become burning pain. Louis described it as feeling like his leg was being held over an open flame from the inside. The skin appeared mottled, with patches of purple and red spreading from his toes upward. Dr. Fagan, still insisting it was nothing serious, ordered more bloodletting. They drained 2 pints of blood from the very leg that was already dying from lack of circulation. August 15th brought the first visible signs of tissue death. Louis's left big toe had turned black. Not the deep purple of a bruise, but the absolute black of dead flesh. When servants removed his silk stocking that morning, the nail simply fell off, revealing gray-green tissue underneath that smelled like rotting meat. The toe itself was cold to the touch, feeling more like stone than flesh. Yet Fagan continued to insist this was merely a severe case of gout. The speed of progression was terrifying. By August 20th, all 5 toes on his left foot were black. The gangrene was visibly creeping up his foot, a dark line advancing like an army of decay. The smell had evolved from merely foul to genuinely dangerous. Servants who entered the room would become lightheaded from the toxic fumes. One young page fainted and had to be carried out after spending just 5 minutes changing the royal linens. August 22nd marked a grotesque milestone when Louis's toes began falling off one by one. The first went during his morning dressing. A servant was pulling on the royal slipper when he felt something give way. Inside the shoe was Louis's big toe, completely detached, looking like a piece of charred wood. The second and third toes fell off that afternoon, simply dropping away from the foot like ripe fruit from a tree. By evening, all 5 toes were gone, leaving exposed bone and putrefying tissue. The medical response was as incompetent as it was desperate. Dr. Fagan finally acknowledged gangrene but insisted it could be cured with his special remedy, a potion made from viper's flesh, crushed pearls, and gold leaf. When that failed, they tried wrapping the leg in cloth soaked in brandy, which only caused excruciating pain as the alcohol burned the exposed tissue. One physician suggested amputation, the only treatment that might have saved Louis's life, but was immediately dismissed. You don't cut off the leg of God's appointed representative on earth. By August 25th, the gangrene had consumed Louis's entire foot and was advancing up his shin. The flesh didn't just die, it liquefied. Black fluid leaked constantly from the decomposing tissue, requiring servants to place bronze basins around the bed to catch the drainage. The room had to be evacuated every few hours because the smell would make people violently ill. Even with windows open and incense burning, the stench could be detected from the palace gardens. Yet Louis remained conscious and, even more remarkably, continued to rule. On August 26th, with gangrene eating his leg, he held a full council meeting from his bed. Ministers stood as far away as possible while still being able to hear his weakened voice. The Duc d'Orléans later wrote that watching the king conduct state business while his leg rotted away was the most surreal and horrifying experience of my life. August 28th brought a new phase of horror. The gangrene had reached Louis's knee and was beginning to affect his other leg. His left leg now looked like something from a battlefield, black, swollen, with exposed bone visible through gaps in the rotting flesh. Pieces would slough off periodically, falling onto the silk sheets with wet sounds that made even hardened soldiers gag. The right foot was beginning to show the telltale purple discoloration that signaled its own journey toward decay. The international reaction to Louis's condition was a mixture of horror and fascination. Every European court had spies at Versailles sending daily updates on the king's decomposition. The British ambassador wrote, "The French king is rotting alive, yet refuses to die. It is as if God himself is making an example of absolutism." The Austrian emperor's representative was more graphic. "Louis XIV is melting like a wax figure placed too close to flame. Each day more of him dissolves into putrid liquid." Courtiers faced an impossible situation. Protocol demanded they attend the dying king, but survival instinct made them want to flee. Those who had to approach Louis wore thick cloth masks soaked in vinegar and herbs. Some rubbed strong mustard under their noses to create a burning sensation that would overpower the smell. The bravest, or most ambitious, would hold their breath for entire conversations, rushing from the room gasping when dismissed. The medical circus reached new heights of absurdity. Physicians from across Europe arrived claiming miracle cures. One prescribed bathing the leg in virgin's urine. Another suggested covering it with fresh cow dung to draw out the poison. A Swiss doctor claimed success with a paste made from ground mummies, which was actually just random human remains mixed with herbs. Louis, desperate and delirious with pain, agreed to try them all. August 30th was when even Louis could no longer maintain the pretense of recovery. The gangrene had spread to his abdomen. His entire lower body was dying, turning black and liquid. He could no longer move his legs, which had become heavy, rotting masses attached to his still-living torso. When servants tried to adjust his position, pieces of flesh would stick to the sheets, tearing away from his body like overcooked meat falling off a bone. The smell had become unbearable even by Versailles standards. Servants wore multiple masks and still vomited. The room had to be constantly ventilated with huge fans operated by teams of servants. Barrels of vinegar were boiled continuously to create acidic steam that might neutralize the stench. Nothing worked. The odor of Louis's decomposition penetrated walls, floors, even sealed containers. Wine stored 3 floors below his chamber was found to have absorbed the taste of decay. September 1, 1715, began at midnight with Louis XIV screaming in Latin. The gangrene had reached his internal organs, and he could feel them shutting down one by one. His kidneys had failed first, causing his body to swell with retained fluids. His liver followed, turning his skin a deep yellow. His intestines, already damaged by decades of medical abuse, simply stopped functioning. The Sun King was drowning in his own bodily waste, unable to expel the toxins that were poisoning him from within. The final hours were documented with clinical precision by Dr. Marescal, who had been brought in to observe what everyone knew would be a historically significant death. His notes, hidden for centuries and only discovered in 1891, provide a minute-by-minute account of how absolute monarchy died. 2 a.m. The king's breathing became labored, rattling with fluid in his lungs. His body was producing a yellow-green foam that bubbled from his mouth and nose. Servants tried to clear it, but it came faster than they could wipe it away. 3 a.m. Louis began hallucinating, speaking to people who had been dead for decades. He held conversations with his mother, who had died in 1666. He issued military commands to generals who had been in their graves for 20 years. At one point, he seemed to believe he was young again, calling for his dancing master and attempting to rise from bed to perform a ballet. His rotting legs, of course, remained motionless. 4 a.m. The smell suddenly intensified to a level that cleared the room. Even the physicians fled. The odor was described as combining rotting flesh, feces, vomit, and something else, a sweet, chemical smell that seemed to burn the inside of the nose. Modern toxicologists believe this was cadaverine and putrescine, the chemicals produced when a body begins decomposing while still alive. 5 a.m. Louis experienced what physicians called the lightning, a brief period of clarity before death. He summoned his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to his bedside. The child had to be held by servants because he was terrified of the rotting monster that had once been his great-grandfather. Louis whispered his famous last advice, "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." The child was immediately removed, sobbing and traumatized. 6 a.m. The gangrene reached Louis's throat. His voice, already weakened, became a whisper, then disappeared entirely. He could only communicate through gestures with hands that shook from systemic toxicity. His fingers had turned blue-black, the nails falling off one by one. 7 a.m. Louis's final coherent act was to call for his confessor. Father Letellier approached, fighting back vomit, to administer last rites. Louis tried to confess but could only make gurgling sounds as fluid filled his throat. The priest performed the shortest last rites in royal history, fleeing the room the moment he finished. 8 a.m. The death agony began in earnest. Louis's body convulsed as his nervous system fired randomly. his back arched off the bed, held in position by rigid muscles for minutes at a time. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Foam, now mixed with blood, poured from his mouth. The convulsions were so violent that his decaying legs, barely attached to his torso, flopped grotesquely with each spasm. 8:15 a.m., September 1, 1715. Louis XIV heart finally stopped. The Sun King was dead. But even in death, his body continued its rebellion. Within minutes, the decomposition that had been held barely in check by his living processes accelerated dramatically. The corpse began swelling immediately, gases building up so quickly that observers could actually see the body expanding. The autopsy had to be performed immediately, within 6 hours of death, because the body was decomposing too rapidly to wait. Dr. Marescal, wearing cloth wrapped around his entire head and breathing through a tube that led outside the room, cut into the royal corpse. What he found defied medical explanation. The entire left side of the body, from foot to throat, was gangrenous. The intestines were twice their normal length and filled with putrid matter. The stomach contained a massive bezoar, a ball of undigested material the size of a melon. Most shocking was a parasitic worm, measuring nearly 3 feet long, still alive in the decaying intestines. The embalming process was a nightmare. The body was decomposing faster than the embalmers could work. The flesh was so corrupted that it wouldn't hold the preservation fluids, which leaked out as fast as they were pumped in. The embalmers, working in shifts because no one could endure the smell for more than minutes at a time, finally gave up on traditional methods. They essentially mummified Louis, wrapping him in hundreds of yards of cloth soaked in alcohol and herbs, then sealing everything in a lead coffin that was soldered shut. Even sealed in lead, the body continued to cause problems. During the funeral procession, gases building up inside the coffin caused it to bulge noticeably. Mourners reported hearing sounds from inside, pops, gurgles, and what one witness described as groaning, though this was likely just gas escaping through microscopic gaps in the seal. The smell somehow penetrated the lead, creating a cloud of decay that followed the funeral procession through Paris. The public reaction was not grief but relief and disgust in equal measure. Parisians, who had suffered under Louis's wars and taxes, openly celebrated. But the manner of his death sobered even his harshest critics. Pamphlets describing his final days were distributed across Europe, each account more grotesque than the last. The death of Louis XIV became a cautionary tale about the limits of absolute power, proof that even those who claimed divine appointment were just flesh that could rot like any common corpse. The death of Louis XIV represents one of history's most perfect ironies. The man who had proclaimed himself the Sun King, who built Versailles as a monument to the perfection of absolute monarchy, who claimed his body was divinely appointed and therefore superior to common humanity, died in a manner that exposed the ultimate equality of all human flesh. His decomposition was not just physical, it was symbolic, representing the rot at the heart of the entire absolutist system. Modern medical analysis of the surviving records reveals just how preventable Louis's suffering was. The anal fistula that started his decline could have been treated with basic hygiene and minor surgery. The gangrene that killed him would have responded to amputation if performed early. The chronic infections that plagued him for decades needed only cleanliness and basic antibiotics to cure. The Sun King died not from any exotic disease but from the toxic combination of arrogance, ignorance, and the belief that royal blood somehow made him immune to basic biology. The immediate cover-up began within hours of his death. Royal secretaries destroyed thousands of documents relating to Louis's medical treatment. Dr. Fagin's detailed records vanished. Court diaries were edited to remove references to the king's decay. Official histories were written that described Louis dying peacefully after a brief illness, maintaining his dignity to the end. The truth was too damaging to the concept of monarchy itself. But the cover-up couldn't hide the impact on those who witnessed Louis's decline. An entire generation of French nobility was traumatized by what they had seen. Many developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as PTSD. The Duchess of Orleans wrote in her private letters about nightmares where she was drowning in the king's putrid fluids. The Duke of St. Simon couldn't eat meat for years because it reminded him of the flesh falling from Louis's legs. Several courtiers who had been forced to attend the dying king closely developed obsessive hygiene habits, bathing multiple times daily in an era when annual baths were the norm. The medical establishment was equally affected. French medicine, which had been considered among Europe's most advanced, was exposed as dangerously incompetent. The treatments given to Louis, the endless enemas, the mercury poisoning, the bizarre potions, were revealed as not just useless but actively harmful. A revolution in medical thinking began, with younger physicians rejecting the ancient humoral theories in favor of observation-based treatment. The spectacular failure to save the Sun King sparked the beginning of modern medical science in France. The political implications were even more profound. Louis XV, traumatized by witnessing his great-grandfather's decay at age 5, developed an obsession with death that would define his reign. He avoided Versailles whenever possible, unable to forget the smell of decomposition that had permeated his childhood. The absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had perfected began its own slow decay, weakening with each generation until it collapsed entirely in the French Revolution. Foreign monarchs learned their own lessons from Louis's grotesque end. The elaborate court ceremonies that had defined European royalty were simplified. The belief in the divine body of the king was quietly abandoned. Monarchs began accepting that they were mortal beings subject to the same physical laws as their subjects. The age of absolutism didn't end with Louis XIV, but his decomposition marked the beginning of its decline. The cover-up continued for centuries. When French historians wrote about Louis XIV, they focused on his wars, his buildings, his cultural patronage, anything but his physical reality. The Palace of Versailles, turned into a museum, presented a sanitized version of court life. Tour guides were instructed never to mention the king's medical issues. The famous paintings of Louis were displayed without noting that they were propaganda hiding a rotting reality. Only in recent decades have historians begun confronting the truth about Louis XIV's physical existence. The medical records that survived the systematic destruction paint a picture that challenges everything we thought we knew about the Sun King. The man we see in portraits, proud, powerful, divine, was a fiction maintained at enormous cost while the real Louis rotted in plain sight. The ultimate tragedy is that Louis himself believed the fiction until almost the end. Even as his body decomposed around him, he clung to the belief that he was God's appointed representative on earth. He never understood that his suffering was the direct result of his own choices, the refusal to bathe, the rejection of medical advice, the insistence that royal blood made him different from other humans. He died believing that his decay was God's mysterious will rather than the predictable consequence of treating his body as if it were exempt from natural law. Today, medical students study Louis XIV's case as an example of how power and delusion can amplify suffering. His death is taught as a cascade of preventable failures, each one made worse by the refusal to acknowledge reality. The Sun King has become a cautionary tale not just about absolute power but about the danger of believing your own propaganda, especially when that propaganda conflicts with basic biological truth. The records that survived the cover-up, hidden in Vatican archives, buried in private collections, discovered in walls during renovations, tell a consistent story. Louis XIV didn't just die. He decomposed while still alive, maintaining the pretense of divine monarchy even as his body proved the ultimate equality of all human flesh. The Sun King's setting was not a gentle fade to darkness but a grotesque spectacle that exposed the rotten core of absolutism itself. This is the truth that was hidden for centuries. The most powerful man in Europe died as the most pathetic, a living corpse whose decay couldn't be stopped by all the power, wealth, and prayer in Christendom. The divine right of kings proved powerless against bacteria, gangrene, and the simple fact that all flesh, no matter how royal, eventually rots. Louis XIV claimed to be the sun, but in the end he was just meat, decomposing like any corpse, proving that death, unlike monarchy, truly is absolute.